The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long golden rays across the polished marble floors. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood quietly in her private sitting room, her fingers tracing the delicate pattern on a china teacup that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on her heart, but there was something else stirring within her, a deep sense of purpose that had been growing stronger each day. William entered the room silently, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet. He had been awake since dawn, walking through the castle grounds, thinking about the conversation they needed to have. The past few months had been particularly challenging for the royal family, with increasing public scrutiny and the constant pressure of their duties weighing on both of them. But today felt different. Today felt like a turning point. "The children are having breakfast with their tutor," William said softly, settling into the armchair across from his wife. Catherine looked up at him, and he could see the mix of determination and vulnerability in her eyes that he had come to know so well over the years. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Catherine replied, setting down the teacup with careful precision. "About finding a way to connect with people on a deeper level, beyond the formal ceremonies and official engagements." The conversation they had shared the evening before had been one of those rare, honest discussions that married couples have when they realize they're at crossroads. They had talked about their role in the modern monarchy, about the distance that sometimes felt insurmountable between the royal family and the people they served. William had expressed his frustration with the formal protocols that often prevented genuine human connection, while Catherine had shared her growing desire to break down some of those barriers. "The world is changing so quickly," Catherine continued, moving to the window where she could see the early morning joggers making their way through Windsor Great Park. "People are facing challenges we can barely imagine from inside these walls. Economic hardship, loneliness, fear about the future. Sometimes I wonder if our carefully planned visits and ribbon-cutting ceremonies really make any difference in their daily lives." William joined her at the window, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. They watched together as an elderly man walked his small terrier, pausing to chat with a young mother pushing a stroller. It was such a simple, ordinary moment, yet it represented exactly the kind of natural human connection that felt increasingly rare in their own lives. "Do you remember when we were first married?" William said, "how we used to talk about doing things differently? About finding ways to be more accessible, more real with people." Catherine smiled, remembering those early days when everything seemed possible and uncomplicated. "We were so idealistic then. I thought we could change everything overnight." "Maybe we weren't wrong," William suggested. "Maybe we just got caught up in the machinery of it all. The schedules, the protocols, the expectations." The idea had been germinating in Catherine's mind for weeks. She had been reading letters from the public, particularly from young people who wrote about feeling disconnected and uncertain about their futures. Many of the letters expressed admiration for the royal family, but also a sense that there was an unbridgeable gap between their world and the reality of everyday life. Catherine had begun to wonder what would happen if she simply stepped away from the formal structure, just for a day, and tried to meet people as Catherine the person, rather than Catherine the princess. "What if we did something completely unplanned?" she said suddenly, turning from the window to face William directly. "What if we just walked out of here today, without the security detail, without the advance team, without any of the usual arrangements, and spent time with ordinary people doing ordinary things?" William raised his eyebrows. The suggestion was both appealing and terrifying. The security team would have our heads, not to mention the private secretaries. "But imagine the freedom of it," Catherine pressed on, her voice growing more animated. "Imagine being able to have a real conversation with someone without worrying about photo opportunities or speaking points. Imagine just being present with people, listening to their stories, sharing in their daily experiences." The more they talked about it, the more the idea took shape. They weren't talking about abandoning their responsibilities or staging some kind of dramatic rebellion against the institution. They were talking about reconnecting with the fundamental purpose of their role, serving the people. And sometimes, Catherine argued, the best service comes from simply showing up as a fellow human being. They spent the morning making quiet preparations. William contacted a trusted friend from his university days who now worked as a teacher in London, asking if he could arrange for them to visit some local community centers and small businesses without any advance notice. Catherine reached out to a few organizations she had supported over the years, explaining that she wanted to make some informal, unannounced visits to better understand the daily challenges people were facing. The hardest part was managing their security. They couldn't simply walk out of the castle without protection, but they also wanted to minimize the formal apparatus that usually surrounded their public appearances. After several tense conversations with their protection officers, they agreed on a compromise, a small, discreet security presence that would maintain distance and allow for genuine interaction with the public. By noon, they were ready. Catherine chose a simple blue dress from her own wardrobe, not one selected by her stylist for a specific event, but something she genuinely liked and felt comfortable wearing. William opted for casual trousers and a sweater that he had owned since before their marriage. They both wanted to look approachable and authentic. Their first stop was a small cafe in Kingston upon Thames, a place Catherine had noticed during a formal visit to the area several months earlier. The owner, an elderly Syrian refugee named Hassan, had served them tea and spoken briefly about his journey to Britain and his struggle to establish his business. Catherine had been deeply moved by his story, but had only been able to spend a few minutes with him due to their tight schedule. When they walked through the cafe door that afternoon, Hassan's face registered complete shock. There were no photographers, no officials, no fanfare, just William and Catherine looking slightly nervous but smiling warmly. The few customers in the cafe turned to stare, unsure if they were seeing correctly. "Your Highnesses," Hassan stammered, nearly dropping the tray he was carrying. We were not expecting. We were hoping we could just sit and talk," Catherine said gently. "Would you mind if we ordered some tea and maybe heard more about how your business is doing?" For the next hour and a half, they sat at a small corner table while Hassan shared the detailed story of his journey. He spoke about fleeing Damascus with his family, spending 2 years in a refugee camp, and arriving in Britain with nothing but hope and determination. He described the challenges of learning English, navigating the bureaucracy of starting a business, and dealing with the subtle prejudices that sometimes made him feel unwelcome. But he also spoke about the kindness he had encountered. The bank manager who took extra time to explain the loan process. The local customers who had become regulars and treated him like family. The neighboring business owners who had offered advice and support. As he talked, other customers began to join the conversation. An elderly woman shared her own story of immigrating from Ireland 50 years earlier. A young college student talked about her part-time job and her worries about student debt. Catherine found herself completely absorbed in these conversations in a way that rarely happened during formal engagements. Without the pressure of staying on schedule or hitting specific talking points, she could simply listen and respond naturally. William, too, seemed more relaxed than she had seen him in months. He asked thoughtful questions about Hassan's experiences and shared stories from his own travels that felt personal rather than rehearsed. When they finally left the cafe, Hassan insisted on packing them a box of his homemade pastries. "You have given me such a gift today," he told them. "Not the honor of your visit, though that means everything to me, but the gift of your time, your attention. You listen to me as a person, not as a symbol or a case study." As they walked down the street toward their next destination, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of genuine accomplishment that had nothing to do with duty or protocol. They had connected with people in a meaningful way. They had learned something real about the lives of their fellow citizens, and they had done it simply by being present and authentic. Their second stop was a community center in nearby Surbiton, where they had heard about a program that brought together elderly residents with young families for intergenerational activities. They arrived to find a room full of toddlers and seniors engaged in what appeared to be organized chaos. Children painting while older adults told stories, teenagers teaching elderly residents how to use smartphones, and a general atmosphere of joyful connection. Margaret, the center's coordinator, was initially flustered by their unexpected arrival. But Catherine and William quickly made it clear that they hadn't come to inspect or evaluate. They had come to participate. Catherine found herself sitting on the floor with a group of 3-year-olds, helping them create finger paintings while listening to their chatter about dinosaurs and favorite foods. William joined a group of elderly men who were teaching teenage volunteers how to play chess, and soon found himself deep in conversation about everything from military service to the changing nature of work. The beauty of the afternoon was that after the initial surprise wore off, people began to forget about the royal titles and simply enjoyed the company of 2 additional volunteers who happened to be named William and Catherine. They were asked about their own children, their hobbies, their opinions on everyday matters. They answered honestly and openly, sharing stories and perspectives that reveal them as parents, spouses, and individuals rather than public figures. One particularly moving moment came when Catherine was talking with an elderly woman named Dorothy, who had been widowed 6 months earlier after 53 years of marriage. Dorothy had been coming to the community center because the loneliness at home had become unbearable, but she was still struggling with depression and isolation. As Catherine listened to her story, she found herself sharing her own experiences with the challenges of public life and the difficulty of maintaining close friendships when your every move is scrutinized. The hardest part, Dorothy said, is that people think they know what you need, but they don't really listen to what you're feeling. Catherine nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. People often want to fix things or offer advice, when sometimes what you really need is just someone to sit with you in the difficulty. They sat together quietly for several minutes, watching the activity around them. It was a moment of genuine human connection that transcended their very different life circumstances. When William found them later, both women were wiping away tears, but they were smiling too. As the afternoon drew to a close, Catherine and William helped clean up the art supplies and stack chairs. They exchanged contact information with several people they had met, not for formal follow-up meetings or official visits, but because they had formed real connections and wanted to maintain them. Margaret, the coordinator, pulled them aside before they left. "I don't know what inspired you to come here today," she said, "but I want you to know that you've changed something in this room. Not because of who you are in the world, but because of how you showed up as people. That's a rare gift." As they drove back toward Windsor in the early evening, Catherine and William sat in comfortable silence, both processing the day's experiences. They had set out with a simple goal, to connect more authentically with people, but they had gained so much more than they had expected. They had been reminded of the fundamental humanity that connects all people, regardless of their circumstances or positions in life. "I feel like I remember now why we wanted to do this work in the first place," Catherine said finally. William reached over and took her hand. "I know what you mean. It's easy to forget, with all the formality and protocol, that at the heart of everything we're supposed to be doing is just caring about people and serving them well." They began making plans for how to incorporate more of these authentic, unscripted interactions into their regular schedule. They talked about the possibility of regular, informal visits to community organizations. They discussed ways to create space in their formal engagements for genuine conversation and connection. Most importantly, they committed to maintaining the perspective they had rediscovered, that their role was fundamentally about service, and that the most effective service often happens through simple presence and authentic attention. As they pulled through the gates of Windsor Castle, Catherine felt a profound sense of gratitude. The day had reminded her that despite all the challenges and constraints of royal life, she and William still had the opportunity to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. They just had to be willing to step outside their comfort zones and show up as the flawed, caring, imperfect human beings they actually were. The success of their impromptu community visits had energized both William and Catherine in ways they hadn't anticipated. Over the following weeks, they found themselves looking for more opportunities to step away from the formal structure of royal engagements and connect with people in authentic ways. Their private secretaries were initially resistant to these unscheduled activities, concerned about security protocols and media management, but the positive feedback from their previous visits gradually convinced the palace staff to become more flexible. Catherine had been particularly affected by her conversation with Dorothy, the widowed woman at the community center. She had exchanged personal contact information with Dorothy, something that would have been unthinkable in a formal royal context, and they had been texting regularly. Dorothy's messages were simple: updates about her day, photos of her garden, questions about Catherine's children, but they represented exactly the kind of normal human connection that Catherine had been craving. One Thursday morning, Catherine received a text from Dorothy that made her pause. "Having a difficult day today," it read. "The house feels so empty. I know you're probably too busy, but if you ever want to come for tea, you'd be very welcome." Catherine stared at the message for several minutes. She had a full schedule that day: a meeting with a children's charity, a formal lunch with foreign dignitaries, and an evening reception for a cultural organization. But something about Dorothy's message struck her deeply. This was exactly the kind of moment that traditional royal protocol would prevent her from responding to. She would be expected to have her private secretary send a polite reply explaining that while the princess appreciated the invitation, her schedule made such personal visits impossible. Instead, Catherine found herself doing something that surprised even her. She cleared her afternoon schedule. "I need to make a personal visit today," she told her private secretary, Sarah, who had been with her for several years and understood her moods better than most. "It's important." Sarah raised her eyebrows, but didn't question the decision. Over the years, she had learned to recognize when Catherine had made up her mind about something, and this was clearly one of those moments. "Should I arrange security and transportation?" "Minimal security," Catherine replied. "I want to drive myself. This needs to feel as normal as possible." 2 hours later, Catherine found herself standing on the doorstep of a modest semi-detached house in Surbiton, holding a bouquet of flowers from her own garden and a tin of biscuits she had baked that morning. When Dorothy opened the door, her face lit up with a mixture of surprise and delight that made Catherine's decision feel completely right. "I can't believe you actually came," Dorothy said, ushering her inside. "I was just having a bit of a rough morning. I didn't expect." "I'm glad you reached out," Catherine said sincerely. "Sometimes we all need someone to have tea with." Dorothy's house was small and filled with the accumulated memories of a long life. Photographs covered every surface: wedding pictures, children's school photos, holiday snapshots spanning decades. Catherine found herself genuinely interested in the stories behind each image. Dorothy showed her pictures from her honeymoon in Scotland, photos of her children as babies, and more recent pictures of her grandchildren. "Harold and I always planned to travel more when he retired," Dorothy said, pointing to a map on the wall with pins marking places they had hoped to visit. "We made it to a few of them, but there were so many we never got to see." They spent the afternoon in Dorothy's small garden, where she had been struggling to maintain the flower beds that had been her late husband's pride and joy. Catherine found herself kneeling in the dirt, helping to plant bulbs for the spring, while Dorothy shared memories of her marriage and her ongoing adjustment to life alone. "The worst part isn't even the loneliness," Dorothy confided as they worked side by side. "It's the feeling that nobody really needs you anymore. When Harold was sick, I had a purpose every day. I was taking care of him, managing his medications, helping him get around. Now I wake up and wonder what the point of my day is going to be." Catherine paused in her digging, moved by Dorothy's honesty. "I think I understand more than you might expect," she said. "There are days when I feel like I'm just going through the motions, fulfilling obligations without really connecting with any meaningful purpose." They talked about purpose and meaning while they planted. Dorothy spoke about her volunteer work at a local food bank and her weekly visits to read to children at the library. Catherine shared her own struggles with finding ways to make her royal duties feel personally meaningful rather than just ceremonial. It was exactly the kind of conversation that would have been impossible in any official context. As the afternoon progressed, Dorothy's spirits visibly lifted. She showed Catherine how to properly plant daffodil bulbs and shared tips for maintaining roses that her husband had taught her. Catherine found herself completely absorbed in the simple pleasure of working in the garden, something she rarely had time to do at home despite having extensive grounds at her disposal. When it came time to leave, Dorothy walked Catherine to her car with tears in her eyes. "You have no idea what this has meant to me," she said. "Not because you're a princess, but because you came as a friend. You listened to me and worked beside me like a daughter would." Catherine hugged her goodbye, promising to return soon. As she drove back toward Windsor, she felt a profound sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with royal duty and everything to do with simple human kindness. She had spent an afternoon helping someone feel less alone in the world, and in doing so, she had reminded herself of why her role mattered beyond the formal ceremonies and public appearances. That evening, she shared the experience with William over dinner. He listened with growing interest as she described her afternoon with Dorothy, and she could see him processing the implications of what she had done. "You just cleared your schedule and went to have tea with someone who was having a difficult day," he said finally. "Yes," Catherine replied, "and it felt like the most important thing I've done in months." William was quiet for a moment, considering this. What would happen if we made this kind of thing a regular part of what we do? Not replacing our formal duties, but supplementing them with genuine personal connections. The idea began to take shape over the following days. Catherine and William started developing what they privately called their listening project, a commitment to regularly making time for unscripted, personal interactions with people in their community. They would continue to fulfill all their official obligations, but they would also create space for the kind of authentic human connection they had discovered in the cafe and community center. Catherine began accepting more personal invitations from people she met during her official visits. When a teacher mentioned that her students were preparing a play about environmental conservation, Catherine asked if she could attend the performance, not as a royal patron making an official visit, but as someone genuinely interested in seeing the children's work. When a small business owner she met at a trade fair mentioned that he was struggling with expanding his operation, Catherine offered to visit his workshop to better understand the challenges facing small entrepreneurs. William, meanwhile, started scheduling regular visits to veteran support groups, not for formal ceremonies or speeches, but simply to spend time with former service members and listen to their experiences. His military background gave him a natural connection with veterans, but these informal visits allowed for conversations that went far deeper than typical official engagements. One particularly meaningful visit took William to a small support group for veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress. The group met weekly in the back room of a community center, and William had been invited by a former helicopter pilot he had met during a formal veterans event. When he arrived for his first visit, the group was discussing the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. "The hardest part," said James, a former infantry sergeant, "is that nobody really understands what you've been through unless they've been there themselves. You try to talk to your family about it, but you can see in their eyes that they're just waiting for you to get better and move on." William nodded, remembering his own struggles after returning from deployment. "I know what you mean about feeling isolated. Even when people want to help, they don't always know how to listen without trying to fix everything." The conversation that followed was unlike anything William had experienced in his official capacity. The veterans shared stories about their service, their injuries, their struggles with alcohol and depression, and their attempts to rebuild their lives. William shared his own experiences with combat stress and the difficulty of processing traumatic events while maintaining a public facade of strength and composure. "You know what's strange?" said Michael, a former Marine who had lost his leg in Afghanistan. "Sitting here talking to you like this makes me feel more normal than any of the therapy sessions I've been to. Not because of who you are, but because you actually get it." William continued attending the group for several weeks, and word began to spread quietly through the veterans community that he was making regular, informal visits. Other support groups began inviting him, not for formal events or speeches, but simply to participate in their ongoing conversations. He found himself looking forward to these visits more than almost any other aspect of his royal duties. Catherine's personal connections were also expanding. Dorothy had introduced her to several other widows in her neighborhood, and Catherine began hosting informal tea gatherings at various locations around London. These weren't official events with media coverage and formal protocols. They were simply opportunities for women who were adjusting to life after loss to spend time together and support each other. One of these gatherings took place at a small cafe in Wimbledon, where Catherine met Eleanor, a woman whose husband had died suddenly of a heart attack just 3 months earlier. Eleanor was struggling not only with grief, but with practical challenges, managing finances for the first time in 30 years, dealing with insurance companies, and learning to navigate daily life without her partner's support. "I feel like such a failure," Eleanor confided to the group. "David handled everything. The bills, the car maintenance, even choosing what to have for dinner. I'm 62 years old, and I feel like a helpless child." Catherine listened as other women in the group shared similar experiences and offered practical advice. But she also recognized an opportunity to connect Eleanor with resources that could help, not through official royal channels, but through the network of people and organizations she had been building through her personal visits. She introduced Eleanor to Hassan, the cafe owner, who had experience navigating British bureaucracy and offered to help her understand her financial documents. She connected her with Margaret from the community center, who ran a support group for people learning to manage household finances. Most importantly, she helped Eleanor see that her struggles were normal and temporary, not signs of personal failure. These personal connections began creating a web of mutual support that extended far beyond Catherine and William's individual relationships. People they had met during their informal visits started connecting with each other. Dorothy began volunteering with Eleanor's grief support group. Veterans from William's support group started helping elderly residents with home maintenance projects. Hassan's cafe became an informal meeting place where people from different backgrounds and circumstances could share stories and offer mutual support. The ripple effects of these authentic connections were becoming visible throughout the community. Local newspapers began reporting on the increased volunteer activity and community engagement, though they didn't initially connect it to Catherine and William's informal visits. The stories focused on ordinary people helping each other, neighbors checking on elderly residents, veterans mentoring troubled youth, small business owners collaborating on community projects. Catherine and William realized that they had stumbled onto something significant. By stepping outside the formal structure of royal duties and engaging with people as individuals rather than representatives of the monarchy, they had catalyzed a kind of community building that no official program could have achieved. They weren't just fulfilling their ceremonial obligations. They were actively strengthening the social fabric of their communities. But they also recognized that this approach required them to be vulnerable in ways that royal protocol typically discouraged. They had to be willing to share their own struggles and uncertainties, to admit when they didn't have answers, and to learn from the people they were supposed to be serving. It was both more challenging and more rewarding than any aspect of their formal duties. As the weeks passed, Catherine and William found that their personal connections were beginning to influence their approach to their official work as well. When they attended formal events, they were more attentive to opportunities for genuine conversation. When they met with government officials or charity leaders, they brought insights from their personal interactions with people facing real challenges. Their formal speeches became more specific and grounded in actual human experiences rather than abstract policy discussions. The transformation was gradual but profound. They were discovering that the most effective way to serve their role as members of the royal family was not to maintain distance and formality, but to bridge the gap between their official positions and their shared humanity with the people they served. As spring arrived, Catherine and William's approach to their royal duties had evolved into something that neither the palace staff nor the public had quite expected. Their calendar now included a mix of formal engagements and what they had come to call connection visits, unscripted meetings with individuals and small groups who had reached out to them or whom they had met during their community activities. The success of these personal interactions had not gone unnoticed. Letters began arriving at the palace from people across the country who had heard through word of mouth about the prince and princess's willingness to engage in genuine conversation. Unlike the formal invitations that typically filled their schedules, these letters contained personal stories, heartfelt struggles, and simple requests for someone to listen. One letter that particularly moved Catherine came from a woman named Sarah in Manchester. Sarah was a single mother of 3 children, working 2 jobs while caring for her elderly mother, who had dementia. Her letter didn't ask for financial help or official intervention. She simply wrote that she felt overwhelmed and alone, and wondered if anyone in a position of influence truly understood what life was like for families like hers. "I see you on television at charity events and official functions," Sarah had written, "and you always look so composed and elegant. I wonder sometimes if you can really understand what it's like to worry about paying rent while trying to give your children a decent life and care for a parent who doesn't always remember who you are. I'm not asking for anything except maybe for someone in your position to know that families like mine exist and are trying our best." Catherine read the letter 3 times before showing it to William. The honesty and vulnerability in Sarah's words struck her deeply, particularly the subtle challenge about whether she could truly understand ordinary struggles from her position of privilege. Rather than feeling defensive, Catherine felt motivated to respond with equal honesty. Instead of having her private secretary send a formal acknowledgement, Catherine decided to write back personally. She shared some of her own experiences with feeling overwhelmed by competing responsibilities and acknowledged that while her circumstances were different from Sarah's, she was also a mother trying to balance work demands with family needs. She offered to visit Sarah if she was willing, not for any official purpose, but simply to learn more about her experiences. 2 weeks later, Catherine found herself on a train to Manchester, accompanied only by a single protection officer who maintained discreet distance. She had arranged to spend the afternoon with Sarah and her family, helping with daily tasks and experiencing firsthand the reality of Sarah's life. Sarah's home was a small terraced house in a working-class neighborhood. When Catherine arrived, she found Sarah in the middle of typical afternoon chaos, helping her 8-year-old daughter with homework while preparing dinner and trying to keep her toddler son from destroying the living room. Sarah's mother, Joan, sat in a chair by the window, sometimes engaging with the activity around her and sometimes staring blankly at nothing. "I can't believe you're actually here," Sarah said, looking slightly embarrassed by the disorder around them. "I'm sorry the house is such a mess. Tuesdays are always crazy because Emma has violin lessons and Josh's football practice, and Mum has been having a difficult week." "Please don't apologize," Catherine said, immediately comfortable with the familiar energy of a busy household. "This looks exactly like my house most afternoons, just with different chaos." Catherine spent the next 4 hours fully immersed in Sarah's daily routine. She helped Emma practice violin while Sarah attended to Joan, who was having trouble remembering where she was. She played with Josh while Sarah prepared dinner, and she listened as Sarah explained the complex logistics of managing her mother's care while maintaining her work schedule. "The hardest part isn't the physical work," Sarah explained as they folded laundry together after dinner. "It's the emotional weight of watching Mum disappear bit by bit. Some days she knows exactly who I am, and we can have wonderful conversations. Other days she looks at me like I'm a stranger, and I can see the fear in her eyes because nothing makes sense to her." Catherine nodded, remembering her own grandmother's struggles with aging and memory loss. "How do you explain it to the children when she has bad days?" "We've learned to be very matter-of-fact about it," Sarah replied. "Emma understands better because she's older, but Josh just accepts that sometimes Grandma is confused and needs extra patience. In some ways, the children handle it better than I do." As if to demonstrate this, Josh approached his grandmother with a picture he had drawn at school. When Joan looked at him blankly, he simply said, "It's okay, Grandma. I'm Josh, and I drew you a picture of our garden. Would you like me to tell you about the flowers?" Catherine watched this interaction with deep admiration. Josh's matter-of-fact acceptance and gentle patience with his grandmother demonstrated an emotional intelligence that many adults struggled to achieve. She found herself learning from this 8-year-old approach to dealing with difficult circumstances. The evening continued with typical family activities, homework supervision, bath time negotiations, and bedtime stories. Catherine participated naturally in all of it, reading to Josh while Sarah helped Emma with her math problems and settled Joan for the night. She was struck by the constant juggling act that Sarah managed with remarkable grace, and by the children's adaptation to responsibilities that many of their peers wouldn't face. When the children were finally in bed and Joan was settled in her room, Catherine and Sarah sat together in the small kitchen with cups of tea. The house was finally quiet, and Sarah looked exhausted but content. "This is the first time in months that I've had adult conversation in the evening," Sarah admitted. "Usually by this time, I'm too tired to do anything except collapse on the sofa and watch television until I fall asleep." "How do you manage to keep your spirits up?" Catherine asked. "I'm amazed by your energy and positivity after everything you're dealing with." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think it's because I see the good things as well as the difficult ones. Emma's getting brilliant marks in school, and she's turning into such a compassionate young woman. Josh makes me laugh every day with his observations about the world. And even though Mom is struggling, she still has moments of clarity where she's exactly herself. I focus on those moments." Catherine found herself deeply moved by Sarah's perspective. Despite facing challenges that would overwhelm many people, Sarah had maintained a focus on gratitude and hope that was genuinely inspiring. She had also created a family environment where her children were learning empathy, resilience, and responsibility in ways that no formal education could teach. "I have to ask," Catherine said, "what made you write to me? What were you hoping would happen?" Sarah smiled. "I honestly didn't expect anything to happen. I think I was just having a particularly difficult day and needed to tell someone who might have influence that families like mine exist and are working hard to get by. I wanted someone in your position to know that most of us aren't looking for handouts or special treatment. We just want our efforts to be recognized and our challenges to be understood." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics from education policy to healthcare access to the social isolation that many families experience when dealing with elderly care responsibilities. Catherine found herself taking mental notes about policy issues she had never fully understood from her formal briefings, but which became crystal clear when viewed through the lens of Sarah's daily experience. When it came time to leave, Catherine exchanged personal contact information with Sarah, just as she had with Dorothy and others. But she also made a commitment to herself to find ways to amplify Sarah's perspective in her official work. The insights she had gained from this visit needed to inform her approach to charity work and public advocacy. On the train back to London, Catherine reflected on the profound impact the day had made on her understanding of her role. She had always known intellectually that many families faced significant challenges, but experiencing those challenges firsthand had given her a much deeper appreciation for the resilience and strength of ordinary people. She felt more motivated than ever to use her position to advocate for policies and support systems that could make a real difference in people's daily lives. Meanwhile, William had been having his own transformative experiences. His regular attendance at veteran support groups had led to invitations to visit former service members in their homes and workplaces. He had spent time with veterans who were struggling with unemployment, learning about the specific challenges they faced in translating military skills to civilian careers. He had visited veterans who were dealing with physical disabilities, gaining insight into the inadequacies of existing support systems. One particularly impactful visit took him to Birmingham, where he met with David, a former Royal Marine who had been medically discharged after losing his right arm in an IED explosion. David had struggled with depression and unemployment for several years after his injury, but had eventually started a small woodworking business from his garage. When William visited, David was working on custom furniture orders while training two other disabled veterans in traditional carpentry techniques. The thing about military service, David explained as he demonstrated his adapted techniques for working with one hand, is that it teaches you to solve problems creatively and to never give up. Those skills don't disappear when you're injured, but the civilian world doesn't always know how to recognize or use them. William spent the day learning about David's business and meeting his apprentices. He was impressed by the quality of their work and by David's innovative approaches to training people with various disabilities. But he was also frustrated by the systemic barriers that made it difficult for veterans like David to access startup funding and business support. I've applied for grants and business loans more times than I can count, David told him. The problem isn't my business plan or my qualifications. It's that most funding organizations don't understand how to evaluate applications from people with non-traditional backgrounds or visible disabilities. These conversations began to influence William's approach to his official duties as well. When he attended formal events related to Veterans Affairs, he brought specific stories and insights from his personal visits. When he met with government officials, he was able to speak with authority about the real challenges facing veterans, not because he had read policy briefings, but because he had spent time in their homes and workplaces. The cumulative effect of these personal connections was beginning to change both Catherine and William's relationship with their royal duties. They were no longer simply fulfilling ceremonial obligations or making symbolic appearances. They were developing genuine expertise about the issues they championed based on direct experience with people who were living those issues every day. Their staff began to notice the change as well. Their speeches became more specific and compelling because they were grounded in real stories rather than abstract statistics. Their questions during briefings became more penetrating because they understood the human impact of policy decisions. Their charity patronages became more effective because they could speak authentically about the work being done and the needs being addressed. But perhaps most importantly, Catherine and William were rediscovering the joy and purpose in their work. Instead of feeling like they were going through the motions of royal duty, they felt genuinely engaged with meaningful work that was making a difference in people's lives. They were learning as much as they were teaching, receiving as much as they were giving. The ripple effects of their approach continued to expand throughout their communities. People they had visited began reaching out to others, creating networks of support and connection. Local organizations started collaborating in new ways, inspired by the examples of cross-community engagement they had witnessed. The focus shifted from individual charity toward community building and mutual aid. As they prepared for what would become their most significant public gesture yet, Catherine and William realized that they had discovered something important about leadership and service. The most effective way to serve others was not from a distance or from a position of assumed authority, but from a place of genuine relationship and mutual respect. They had learned that their titles and positions gave them access and resources, but their humanity gave them the ability to connect and inspire. The moment that would resonate across the globe began with a simple text message that arrived on Catherine's phone during a quiet Sunday morning at home. It was from Dorothy, the widow she had befriended months earlier, and its brevity made it all the more poignant. Harold's favorite bench in the park has been removed for repairs. Feeling a bit lost without our special place. Hope you're well. Catherine stared at the message for several minutes, understanding immediately what Dorothy meant. During their many conversations, Dorothy had shared that she visited a particular bench in the local park every Sunday morning, where she would sit and talk to her late husband as if he were still with her. It was a ritual of connection, her way of maintaining their relationship despite his physical absence. The bench represented much more than a place to sit. It was Dorothy's anchor in a world that often felt rootless without Harold beside her. William found Catherine in their bedroom, still holding her phone with a thoughtful expression. "Everything all right?" he asked, settling beside her on the window seat where she often retreated when she needed to think. Catherine showed him the message, then explained the significance of the bench in Dorothy's weekly routine. As she spoke, she could see William processing not just Dorothy's situation, but the broader implications of what she was describing. "So many people must have places like that," William said quietly. "Locations that hold special meaning, rituals that help them cope with loss or maintain connections to people they love. And we just removed her anchor without thinking about what it meant to her," Catherine replied. "The council probably saw an old bench that needed repair. They couldn't know it was someone's sanctuary." They spent the morning discussing Dorothy's situation, but the conversation gradually expanded to include all the people they had met over the past several months. They talked about Sarah's daily struggle to balance work and family responsibilities, about the veterans who gathered weekly to support each other through ongoing challenges, about Hassan's quiet determination to build a new life in an unfamiliar country. Each person they had encountered was dealing with some form of loss, transition, or challenge that required both practical support and emotional resilience. "I keep thinking about something Eleanor said last week," Catherine continued, referring to another widow in Dorothy's support network. "She mentioned that the hardest part of grieving isn't the dramatic moments of overwhelming sadness. It's the small, everyday reminders that life has changed permanently. Like Harold's empty coffee cup that Dorothy still sets out each morning, or the way Eleanor automatically buys two of everything at the grocery store." William nodded, remembering similar observations from his conversations with veterans. David mentioned something like that too, how the biggest adjustment after his injury wasn't learning to work with one hand, but dealing with all the tiny daily reminders that his life had changed. The way people look at him differently, the automatic assumptions about what he can or can't do. As they talked, an idea began to form between them. They had been making individual connections with people facing various challenges, but they realized that there might be value in bringing some of these people together. Not for a formal event or charity function, but for a simple gathering where people who were navigating different kinds of loss or transition could share their experiences and support each other. What if we created a space where Dorothy could talk to some of the veterans about resilience, Catherine suggested, and where Sarah could share her insights about managing multiple responsibilities with some of the other single parents we've met. A kind of informal community where people could learn from each other's experiences, William added. Not therapy or formal support groups, but just authentic conversation between people who understand what it means to rebuild your life after everything changes. The idea excited them both, but they also recognized that it would require careful thought and planning. They wanted to create something meaningful without making it feel artificial or staged. Most importantly, they wanted to ensure that any gathering genuinely served the participants rather than simply providing another opportunity for royal engagement. They decided to start small. Catherine reached out to Dorothy, Sarah, and Eleanor, while William contacted David and several other veterans from his support group visits. Instead of proposing a formal event, they simply invited everyone to a casual afternoon gathering at a private location. Not a palace or official venue, but a comfortable community space where people could relax and be themselves. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Everyone they contacted expressed interest, not just in attending, but in meeting the other people Catherine and William had described. Dorothy was particularly excited about the possibility of talking with veterans who had experience dealing with major life transitions. David was curious to meet Sarah and learn about her strategies for managing complex daily responsibilities. They settled on a community center in Richmond, a neutral location that was easily accessible but wouldn't feel intimidating or overly formal. Catherine and William arranged for simple refreshments and comfortable seating arrangements that would encourage natural conversation rather than formal presentations. On the afternoon of the gathering, Catherine arrived early to help set up, bringing flowers from her own garden and homemade biscuits. William came directly from an official engagement, but had changed from his formal attire into casual clothes that would help him blend in rather than stand out. As people began to arrive, the atmosphere was immediately warm and welcoming. Dorothy was the first to arrive, bringing photo albums that showed Harold's garden through the seasons. Sarah came with Emma, who had been curious about meeting a princess, but quickly became more interested in Dorothy's stories about growing up during the war. David brought samples of his woodworking, which impressed everyone and led to an extended conversation about the therapeutic value of working with your hands. What followed was exactly what Catherine and William had hoped for, but even more natural and meaningful than they had anticipated. Without any formal structure or agenda, people began sharing their stories and discoveries. Dorothy talked about the strategies she had developed for managing loneliness, while David shared techniques he had learned for adapting to physical limitations. Sarah discussed her approaches to maintaining optimism during difficult periods, while Eleanor shared what she had learned about asking for help when you're used to being independent. The conversations were honest and sometimes emotional, but they were also filled with laughter and mutual appreciation. People discovered unexpected connections. Dorothy and David both talked about the importance of maintaining routines when everything else in life feels uncertain. Sarah and Eleanor found they shared similar challenges in learning to make decisions independently after years of collaborative partnership. Catherine and William participated naturally in these conversations, sharing their own experiences with pressure, uncertainty, and the challenge of maintaining authentic relationships in unusual circumstances. But they were primarily there to facilitate and support, ensuring that everyone felt comfortable and heard. As the afternoon progressed, something beautiful began to happen. People started making plans to stay in touch with each other. Dorothy invited David to visit her garden and share his expertise about plant care. Sarah and Eleanor decided to explore childcare sharing arrangements that could give them both more flexibility. David offered to teach woodworking skills to anyone interested in learning a new creative outlet. Near the end of the gathering, Hassan arrived unexpectedly. He had heard about the meeting through David, whom he had met during one of Catherine's previous visits to his cafe. He brought a tray of pastries and tea, transforming the afternoon into an impromptu feast that felt like a celebration. "This is what community should feel like," Hassan said as everyone gathered around his food. People from different backgrounds and circumstances, but all supporting each other through life's challenges. Catherine felt tears welling up as she looked around the room. This was exactly what she and William had been hoping to create through their individual visits and personal connections, not dependence on royal charity or formal support systems, but genuine community where people could find strength and resources in each other. The gathering concluded with everyone exchanging contact information and making concrete plans for future meetings. They decided to continue meeting monthly, rotating the location between different community spaces and sometimes meeting in people's homes. Catherine and William were invited to continue participating, but it was clear that the group would sustain itself regardless of their involvement. As they helped clean up after everyone had left, Catherine and William reflected on what they had witnessed. They had facilitated something that would continue to grow and develop without their constant involvement. They had helped create a network of mutual support that extended far beyond any individual relationship they might maintain. "I think this might be the most important thing we've ever done," Catherine said as they stacked chairs and collected teacups. "Not because of anything we did specifically, but because we helped people find each other." William nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "It's like we've been the introduction rather than the main event. We connected people who can now support each other in ways we never could." In the days that followed, word of the gathering began to spread quietly through various communities. Not through media coverage or official announcements, but through the personal networks of the people who had participated. Dorothy mentioned it to other members of her grief support group. David shared the experience with his fellow veterans. Sarah talked about it with other parents at her children's school. The response was immediate and widespread. People began reaching out to Catherine and William, not asking for personal meetings or individual attention, but expressing interest in creating similar gatherings in their own communities. Teachers wanted to connect parents facing similar challenges. Healthcare workers wanted to bring together patients dealing with chronic conditions. Community leaders wanted to facilitate conversations between people from different cultural backgrounds. Catherine and William realized that they had inadvertently sparked a movement toward authentic community building that had the potential to spread far beyond their direct involvement. People were inspired not by royal endorsement or official programs, but by the simple example of individuals supporting each other through honest conversation and mutual aid. Their private secretaries began receiving requests from communities across the country asking for guidance on organizing similar gatherings. Rather than creating formal programs or official initiatives, Catherine and William decided to share their approach as openly and simply as possible. They wrote a brief letter that was shared through community organizations, describing the principles that had made their gathering successful: authentic conversation, mutual respect, voluntary participation, and focus on what people could offer each other rather than what they needed from external sources. The letter concluded with a paragraph that captured the essence of what they had learned. We have discovered that the most effective way to support people through difficulties is not to provide solutions from above, but to create spaces where people can find strength and wisdom in each other. Every person has experiences that can help others, and every person has needs that others can meet. Community happens when we remember that we are all both teachers and students, both helpers and people who need help. Within weeks, similar gatherings were taking place in dozens of communities across Britain. Each one was unique, reflecting the specific needs and interests of local participants, but all were based on the same principles of authentic connection and mutual support. Veterans were meeting with refugees to share experiences of adaptation and resilience. Single parents were connecting with elderly residents to provide mutual assistance with childcare and companionship. People dealing with chronic illnesses were sharing resources and encouragement with others facing similar challenges. The movement spread beyond Britain as well. The letter was translated into multiple languages and shared through international networks. Communities in other countries began organizing their own gatherings, adapting the approach to their local cultures and needs. What had started as a simple response to Dorothy's loneliness had become a global example of how authentic human connection could address social isolation and community fragmentation. Catherine and William continued to participate in their original monthly group, but they also began attending other gatherings when invited, always as participants rather than guests of honor. They discovered that their presence was less important than the example they had set, and the permission they had given people to prioritize authentic connection over formal programming. The most profound impact, however, was on Catherine and William themselves. Through facilitating these connections and participating in ongoing community conversations, they had redefined their understanding of royal service. They were no longer primarily representatives of an institution performing ceremonial functions. They had become catalysts for the kind of social connection and mutual support that strengthened the fabric of society in ways that no official program could achieve. Their gesture had indeed resonated across the globe, but not because it was dramatic or unprecedented. It resonated because it was deeply human, addressing the universal need for authentic connection and community support that transcends cultural and economic differences. They had shown that leadership is most effective when it facilitates others' capacity to support each other, rather than creating dependency on external authority or resources. As they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point, Catherine and William realized that their most touching parting had been from the formal constraints and expectations that had previously defined their roles. By choosing to engage authentically with people as individuals rather than subjects, they had discovered not only a more effective way to serve, but a more meaningful way to live.